Hello, I'm Michael Tice, and I'll be presenting to you today my thesis research, Andrew Taylor Still's Conception of Immunity, Its Essence and Application. So at the outset here, I would like to acknowledge my wife, Monica, for her ceaseless support through every step of this, as well as to thank my thesis advisor, Paul Sitka, for the abundance of time, patience, and dedication that he also invested into this project. So the word conception was chosen very intentionally. It's one word that encompasses two meanings, indicating multiple questions. What was Still's understanding of immunity, and how did he come to that understanding? These questions inform the purpose of this study. And I should note, to the best of my knowledge, this is the only study of its kind to date. So the purpose of this study was to inquire into those first two questions, but also to ask, how did Still practically apply that understanding? And most importantly, are there any aspects of that understanding that could enhance a modern osteopathic practice? Clinical applicability was the goal of this study. That goal was informed by a number of stages of inquiry. Still's conception of immunity was contextualized inside of his own time and place, his personal worldview, and the events that have occurred since his death. These all yielded different meanings that were then compared and sifted for modern clinical applicability. So that process of inquiry was formalized into these four research questions. Though the research process was cyclic, each question can be roughly understood as being a particular stage of the research process, which I will discuss in a minute. But first, a bit of background. In the process of conducting this study, a trend was identified. During the proposal writing stage, as the literature review began, within the key informant interviews, the historical osteopathic literature, the modern osteopathic literature, it became apparent that there is a widespread agreement, or simply many demonstrations, that Still's conception of immunity has been largely lost, disregarded, and misunderstood by the osteopathic community from Still's own era continuously up to today. This informs the justification of this study. Have you watched the news lately? TLC is in pretty short supply out there. I felt like this painting was pretty much a synopsis of where things are at right now, which is just to say that solutions are urgently required to address a whole host of pressing issues. If Still's claims regarding osteopathy's immunological utility are true to any significant degree, then a modern revisiting of his understanding of immunity would be of extreme value. It would be an appropriate tool to engage with many of today's most immediate concerns, such as the global pandemic that began in the final month of conducting this research, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which are only becoming increasingly relevant, the economic costs of orthodox technological healthcare, which makes it inaccessible to most of the world's population, and simply the general issue of prevention of disease, which is not being adequately addressed under the existing orthodox model. I could go on, but anxiety and depression suppress immune function, so let's leave it at that. As far as the technical nitty-gritty of the research design, this study employed two styles, documentary historical and field. Documentary historical style was necessary given that we can't interview Still himself. At best, we can access the artifacts surrounding his life and then use them to best interpret meaning from his body of written work. The basic themes that emerged from that initial process led to the seeking out of modern individuals who have a specialized knowledge of a particular emergent theme. This was where the field style found its application in the interviewing of key informants who had specialized relevant knowledge of Still. Only such individuals were sought as key informants, thus it was a criterion sample. Snowball sampling was also employed. Key informants were asked if they knew of other potential appropriate key informants, as well as being asked for referrals to further relevant literature. Potential key informants were solicited with a letter of introduction, and if amenable to participation, they were then required to sign a consent form. In the end, 9 key informants from 4 countries agreed to participate in this research. Interviews were conducted in person, via video conferencing, phone calls, and Facebook Messenger. They were unstructured, meaning that the questions were not the same from informant to informant, and the flow of conversation itself was the primary determinant of the direction and content of the interview. Modern literature found to be relevant was also incorporated throughout the research process. This included modern orthodox research regarding immunity, as well as relevant modern osteopathic quantitative studies and related commentary. In the end, 370 sources of literature were cited in this research, with 63 of those being articles or books by Andrew Taylor Still. Interviews were conducted in person via video conferencing, phone calls, and Facebook Messenger. They were unstructured, meaning that the questions were not the same from informant to informant. This is exactly what I just said. Good thing I caught that now. Data analysis was conducted via the editing organization style, which was a collage-like arrangement of extracts from the literature with my own commentary and insights incorporated. This was a literal copy and paste of screenshots from electronic texts or my own typing up of quotes from Still. I found that actually rewriting out Still's text was very helpful in that it gave me a better appreciation for the cadence of his thought. And to a certain degree, it was a literal means of following in his footsteps. It meant I could not ignore a single word. The second data analysis method was immersion crystallization, which is just a fancy way of saying that I steadily obsessed over this topic every waking and sleeping moment for 4 years running. Just ask my long-suffering wife. For example, I kept a notepad beside my bed, so if I woke up at 3 a.m., I could write down any new connections. My morning yoga practice also often spontaneously yielded fresh insights. Then during my clinical practice, I constantly tested the accuracy of these new understandings by attempting to apply them with my patients and then observing the outcomes. Which is to say that this research did not take place primarily on a computer screen. As much as possible, the material was explored experientially. This was the benefit of a 4-year research timeline. It gave enough time for me to learn how to learn, and the process lasted so long that the topic and I each eventually shaped the other. So on a more practical level, these two organization styles play out as coding. Coding is a means of producing pattern recognition within a large set of data. Once a code is established, the complete original text can be revisited, searching for other instances of that new code, as well as connections between the variety of existing codes. This is a picture here of 2 pages from Still's 1902 book, and you can see that I've returned to the text many times with new insights emerging with each cycle. As the result of this cyclic process, the interrelated set of codes created a meshwork from which an overarching essence or story then came about. From this story, a narrative account was given, this being the answer or response to each of the research questions. So now that we've gone over how the study was constructed and enacted, let's discuss the really interesting stuff, the findings. So now, due to the time constraints of this presentation, I feel a little bit now as though I must attempt to describe this in about this much detail. So the enormous scope of this research was a blessing and a curse. I really wanted to hold true to defining Still's personal conception of immunity, but in short order, it was revealed that that conception of immunity quite literally incorporates the whole of reality, both in general and in particular, and then each in relation to the other, back and forth endlessly. So engaging with Still's perspective was fascinating, rewarding, and lengthy. So I want to thank each member on the jury today for having read the extensive thesis that resulted, as that now frees me to focus on what is of most clinical relevance in these findings, that being the goal of this study. So I won't have time to discuss Still's experiences with smallpox, vaccination, and how this helped to shape his conception of immunity. Nor will I go into detail regarding the traditional orthodox medical system that included the miasmatic model of disease, other than to say that Still was raised and originally trained in this system as an MD and remained a lifelong adherent to it. This model held that invisible poisonous gases carried the seeds of disease into a host. But if these seeds were to germinate and grow, they needed the proper conditions. This miasmatic medical system held that the process of disease was a type of internal rot, an exponential spread of pathological influence from one individual to another within a community, or from a localized area in an individual's body outwards, eventually consuming them entirely. Dandelions. Dandelions are invasive and can't be stopped. They are so the only options are to cut them out or poison them. At least this is our cultural narrative. No one is cutting out or poisoning dandelions in a mature forest, and yet there are no dandelions growing there. Surely their seeds are continuously carried in on the wind. There are no dandelions in the woods because the soil conditions are not conducive to their presence. This is exactly how Still viewed the body, as an internal soil that must be kept in a healthy condition so that the disease seeds to which we are constantly exposed do not have the circumstances in which they can germinate, take root, mature, and reproduce. This internal soil was composed, in Still's mind, of what would be today called the interstitial or extracellular space and its terminal vessels. Still called this the fascia or the lymphatics. His understanding of this structure-function dynamic was highly prescient and remains accurate when compared to modern descriptions of the same. In fact, I would argue that in some regards, even today, Still's understanding remains more nuanced and developed. So let's jump straight into some Stillian observation and pattern recognition in the world at large. Here is a satellite photo of a mountain range and its associated waterways. Here is the internal surface of a right parietal bone. This is an aerial photograph of a confluence in a river system, and this is the lambda of a human skull. This is the left temporal and right scapula from the same individual, and this is their left scapula and right innominate. This forensic field guide warns investigators to avoid confusing the left perinatal scapula with the right pars lateralis, that being one of the occipital segments, the one that composes the lateral border of the foramen magnum. And on this next slide, real quick, what bone are we looking at here? The innominate. Actually, in fact, this is the superior surface of C1, the atlas. It seems everywhere we look within reality, form is composed of a repetition of self-similar forms, repeated on a variety of scales. If we zoom in or we zoom out, eventually we end up seeing the very same image. The human form is but one more instance of this same phenomenon. Still also noticed this same quality in reality and wrote about it many times. So is this all just neato? Or is it a signpost pointing towards an essential meaning? Still proposed that this omnipresence of coherent organization taking place throughout all of reality was indicative of a fundamental principle underlying it, a singular cause that produces this multitude of similar effects. It's one reason why Still's worldview was so vital to understand if we're to best comprehend his personal conception of immunity, because it was his worldview, his understanding of reality in general, that he then later applied in particular as a medical intervention that he named osteopathy. This repetition of form can be referred to as the holographic principle. If you take a hologram and cut it in half, each half doesn't display a portion of the image, rather it then displays the whole image yet again, as viewed from a particular perspective. Notice the difference in the stars. It would seem that reality in general and reality in particular mirror each other. In short, this is how Still understood reality as a whole, a single phenomenon, a unity that manifests itself as a multiplicity of expressions, much the same as a single tree expresses itself as roots, trunk, branches, leaves, fruit. Yes, each of these is the tree, but none of them individually is the tree itself. Neither is the sum total of these expressions the tree. The tree is something other than its expressions, yet each expression is the tree, present as manifestation. This was the shift in perspective that Still traversed in the course of his life, from what would be categorized as a monotheistic worldview, wherein a divine creator then created a separate and distinct, static, unchanging universe, towards what would be categorized as a panentheistic worldview, wherein the ultimately unknowable divine ground of reality continuously manifests itself as the universe, yet is not limited to the universe itself. Importantly, this then includes human beings as branches of the divine tree. When Still refers to God, he is pointing to that which manifests itself as time and space, the infinite potential from which the phenomenon of time and space emerges, the unformed, that which has no character except to contain the potential of all possible characteristics. A discussion such as this is necessary, given that Still's revised definition of God was a foundation of his conception of osteopathy. Take, for instance, Still's autobiography, where he uses this word God 235 times, for comparison, only using the word osteopathy 214 times. Yet how do these patterns come about and then persist? How is it that the undifferentiated formless unity comes to present itself as the appearance of individualized beings? Now we're talking about Still's definition of a self, and seeing how the interaction of self in relation to non-self is the basis of orthodox immunity, it's also necessary to define Still's worldview in this regard. Still drew strongly on the work of Herbert Spencer, the British philosopher, thus coming to hold that an individualized life was a region of coherently organized motion. That region of coherence exists in relation to the exterior, the non-self. To maintain internal coherence, the self must take in external motion and transform it into resonance with the internal coherence. Aspects of the interior that have lost coherence then must be excreted across the boundary and become non-self once again. On the level of a whole organism, inflow would be food, water, air, love. Outflow would be feces, urine, exhaled air, sweat, and love. So from this viewpoint, a biological individual is best understood as a process rather than an object. Still had concluded that the same force that initially creates an individual is then the very same force that perpetuates it through time and space via regeneration and protection. This process was referred to as self-organization within this research. Still saw regeneration or metabolism and defense or immunity as being but two branches of the same tree, two expressions of that same universal source. Still did not see death and disease as being caused by the presence of abnormal disease processes. Rather, he viewed these as being an absence of appropriate self-organization. Still's medical interventions, therefore, did not consist of freeing the patient of obstructions or of disease agents. Rather, his intention was simply to provide better conditions in which the patient's inherent capacity for perfect adaptation had a better array of options from which to choose. Still sought to facilitate the restoration of a normality of autonomy. Still acted out this intention by interacting with the dynamics that cross the boundary that defines self from non-self on whatever scale, tissue, organ, bodily region, or individual as a whole. The ratio of inflow to outflow determines the amount of content that is present at any one time within the collection space that links them. Still's primary focus was on fluid flow. Again, this took place on any of those relevant scales. It is this ratio of the rate of inflow versus outflow that determines whether swelling and stagnation occur, or deficiency and atrophy, or health. This was primarily what Still was referring to when he referred to the fascia, the lymphatics, the interstitial space acting as a collection space for the fluids that carry the building blocks of life in and waste products out, which is to say metabolism. Still applied this same understanding to the innate defensive capacities of the body. They required constant, appropriate fluid flow if they were to be enacted. Beavers. They are renowned for their ability to intentionally create an environment that best provides for their own nourishment and defense. This is exactly what pathogens and malignant growths do within their host. They intentionally disrupt the ratio of inflow versus outflow within the tissue as a means of disabling the host's immune function and thus providing the nutritive and defensive conditions that allow the pathogen or the malignant growth to thrive. And let's take this beaver metaphor a step further. You can poison the beavers, you can cut them out, but their dam and all of its resultant alterations of the dynamics in the landscape will nevertheless remain indefinitely. These are the findings of recent orthodox immunology. The best predictor of the transition from HIV to AIDS is not the pathogen load of the host, but the state of their immune function. The pathogens that are an origin of many infectious diseases can be completely eradicated from the host by the immune response, yet the host will nevertheless die as a result of the process of disease that was only initiated by the pathogen. Orthodox immunology refers to this process as a cytokine storm. Once the disease process gets rolling, if not re-regulated, it becomes an avalanche. This is the mechanism behind sepsis, the leading cause of death worldwide in ICUs, and a central element to many, if not most, infectious diseases, like the 1918 Spanish flu and COVID, even autoimmune disorders. All of these centrally contain a cytokine storm dynamic. It is often not the presence of the pathogen that kills a patient, it is the poor ratio between the damage done by the patient by the damage done to the patient by their own immune response versus the damage done to the pathogen by the immune response. Pathogens and malignant growths intentionally initiate this immunopathology, these cytokine storms, in their host, just like a beaver altering their environment. They do not want a fair fight. And this is how Orthodox medicine has historically conceptualized an infectious disease, a castle under siege with attackers and defenders, the pathogen versus the immune system, right? And that is all fine and accurate, but the model should not end there. Orthodox medical culture has largely overlooked the interior of the castle and the vital roles taking place inside of it. For example, the civilians that are putting out fires from flaming arrows that have been shot in through the windows, or those down in the basement managing the food stores so that the castle can endure an extended siege while they wait for reinforcements to arrive. Putting out a fire before it spreads is just as important as shooting an enemy soldier, probably even more so. This is the mechanism by which osteopathic treatment can effectively and powerfully influence the trajectory of an infectious disease or any other disease process. Every disease involves inflammation. This is how osteopathy holds the potential to interrupt a cytokine storm, which just so happens to be in exact alignment with Still's understanding of the spread of fermentation, a type of errant chemical reaction that is perpetuated exponentially from a highly localized area spreading out to consume the whole. The historical Orthodox model of infectious disease was very simple: pathogen load versus disease resistance. Either kill off the pathogens directly, like with an antibiotic, or increase the disease resistance in advance of exposure via vaccination. But a more nuanced understanding is highly advantageous, as it reveals that there is more than one strategy that can profoundly and beneficially help tip the scales in a patient's favor. We can also seek to increase disease tolerance, to increase immunoregulation, thereby avoiding intense self-damage during an immune response. There is a reciprocal relationship between immunoregulation and immune function. They are two branches of the same tree. A stronger defensive capacity allows for greater offensive efficacy. This was the understanding that informed Still's therapeutic strategy. It remained the same in acute, chronic, even palliative scenarios for the entire gamut of disease processes. Still accomplished this by normalizing the flow into and out of specific scales of organization. So if disease is best understood as an exponential process of loss of normality, and health is the regenerative outcomes of appropriate self-organization, then a series of appropriately spaced anatomico-physiological renormalizations would not only increase the rate of repair and decrease the time needed to mount superior defenses, but thereby significantly alter the overall trajectory of the disease process, meaning that, in the end, patients not only recover faster with osteopathic care, but they have far less to recover from. Again, all of this was accomplished via interaction with the rate and ratio of flow in versus flow out, which is to say that Still treated immunologically via a normalization of metabolism. This is the very same newly discovered relationship that is rocking the Orthodox medical community. Metabolism and immune function have now been discovered as being but two sides of the very same coin. A shift in one dictates the state of the other. The clinical implications of this are overwhelming. But to return to frequency of treatment, during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, an osteopath in Kirksville, Ann Howes, reported that her patients required 6 treatments per 24-hour period for their first 3 days of illness. That is 18 treatments in 72 hours. These treatments, we can historically contextualize, only lasted around 10 minutes, give or take. Still is reported to have successfully treated the growths in Margaret Hildreth's eyelids and eyes by working with her once a week for 2 years straight. Still wrote an article for prospective patients of the Kirksville Infirmary, informing patients that, for example, in the case of asthma, they should expect 1 to 3 of these short treatments per week, and that even at that huge rate of treatment, even at that rate of treatment, 75% of people with asthma would be curable in from 2 to 4 months, while the remainder of cases should expect to take even longer than that to reach resolution, even at that high rate of frequency. This is radically different from the modern osteopathic practices that I was taught during my own 5 years of in-class osteopathic education. So I wish I could discuss a lot more here. There is so much that I have cut out for time, but let's move on to discussing how these findings can be clinically implemented. Firstly, we need to begin with incorporating an understanding of this historical treatment framework into modern osteopathic education. If osteopaths do not understand how treatment is supposed to work, we're far less likely to provide interventions that do work as well as they could. As much as possible, frequency of treatment should be determined by biological factors, not socioeconomic ones. It would seem that shorter, more frequent treatments that often last for a longer time frame would be much more suitable for the needs of our patients. It would also go a long way to restoring the historical scope of manual osteopathy. So we must also begin to educate our patients. Even beyond that, we as practitioners do not need to be present for the osteopathic treatment to take place. We can teach our patients to treat themselves. We can teach family members to treat each other. Still took both of these approaches as a means of empowering his patients and increasing the frequency of their osteopathic treatments. Furthermore, in my mind, exercise, yoga, breathwork, fasting, these are all osteopathic interventions. They are all applications of the osteopathic philosophy, just the same as manual care. If Still had discovered antibiotics and suggested in his writings that they be dosed 3 times per week for 3 weeks, then modern osteopaths would be doing something along the lines of giving a single triple dose once a week. So why are we so surprised that we aren't getting the same results as Still and the early osteopaths? We might be using the same tools, but we are not using the same approach. I look at frequency of treatment now like working with an old hand water pump. Yes, you have to have a minimum efficiency with each stroke of the pump, but really what matters so much more is how often you pump that pump and how long you keep pumping that pump. This is my answer now to that question that patients always ask, usually after that first treatment, how many treatments is this going to take? And I'll tell them, I don't know, but I can feel the pressure build with each pump of the handle. So as long as we keep it up long enough, often enough, we're going to get water sooner or later. And this is really the single biggest clinical relevant finding of this research. It seems that in modern osteopathy, we spend so much time discussing how our interventions have to be incredibly precise and incredibly accurate. Does it not then also follow that the frequency with which those interventions are implemented is also of at least as much importance? This is a picture of Still climbing a pear tree. I feel that for the modern osteopathic community, we do not need a new fancy technique nearly so much as we need to implement more appropriate frequency of treatment. We need to pick the low-hanging fruit first, then go through all the effort of climbing all up to the top of that pear tree to get the last elusive pear. Reflecting on this research, I feel that it did well in a number of ways. In terms of contextualizing Still's writings, a number of important connections were made that I didn't encounter anywhere else, though I should acknowledge that my synthesis was strongly informed by the work of others. And it was certainly, this research was in sync with the world at large. The popular media began discussing the interstitium during this research. All of the immunometabolism research from the Orthodox community that I cited was published during the timeline of my own study. And the global pandemic that began in the final month of writing these findings up. Let me say that from the perspective of this research, COVID-19, yes, is a novel human pathogen, but the pathological process that it induces is universally common and familiar to osteopathy. In terms of shortcomings, I could have critiqued Still more thoroughly, and the key informant processes could have been optimized in a few very important ways. As far as future research goes, the findings of this research spread out into many interesting branches that should be followed. I feel that the foremost of these is the role of Still's holographic worldview in better interpreting the findings of modern research involving the structure-function relationship that may dictate metabolic rates across biological species. In conclusion, as this research unfolded, I was struck by the many exciting recent advances taking place in orthodox medical research, such as immunotherapy, mechanotransduction as a means of both cancer genesis and potential treatment, immunometabolism as a new and fundamental field of study, the central importance that immunopathology and immunoregulation play in clinical outcomes, and the role that compartmentalized abnormalities of microcirculation play in initiating and perpetuating cytokine storms. All of these cases can be understood as instances of the structure-function relationship that was a foundation of Still's osteopathic philosophy. In each paper from the Orthodox community that I read on these topics, the researchers would conclude by more or less stating, if only we had a way that we could enact these new concepts that are coming to light, to apply these new theoretical understandings, the clinical results would be so profound. And this is what most impressed me about Still's work from the late 1800s. Not only did he come to a theoretical understanding of these principles so early, but he also then innovated an application of them that was effective. Yet modern osteopathy seems to be moving further and further away from Still's vision. Given this, while it's interesting and highly useful to deeply understand osteopathy through the use of modern scientific research, it also points to the fact that today's osteopathic community must not rely on evidence-based practices alone, not unless we wish to wait another 140 years for orthodox validation of the methods that we can already currently employ in the service of our communities. The fruit is hanging very low. Let's not let it rot on the branch. Thank you.